A number of new genetic identities originated on the Bengal-Andaman coast during the last glacial period. These post-glacial period paternal haplogroups like R1 alpha, R1 bravo and O haplogroup in Y chromosome are most extensively studied. As the seawater increased, it caused submersion of the Bengal-Andaman coast in three phases during the last interglacial period. These resulted in migration of the settled population all over the world with their language and culture. These genetic identities which originated on the Bengal-Andaman coast could very well be the ancestors of the Indian population. Thus, Indian population originated locally and they have not come from anywhere else. Thus, my view regarding the origin of the Indian population based on ground evidences is completely opposite that of the existing view that India is a melting pot and people have come from different directions. Namaskar. I am grateful to Sangam Talks for giving me one more opportunity to discuss about the pre-recorded period of India and that of the world. At this stage, we are not very sure about the antiquity of the Indian civilization. We consider that it is one of the oldest civilizations of the world, if not the oldest. However, from scientific point of view, we have failed to arrange the exact period of origin of the Indian civilization. It is obvious that major coastal archaeological evidences are not easily available, possibly because it has submerged due to the rise of the sea level during the interglacial period. Gulf of Khambhat Cultural Complex and Dwarka have been discovered in the meantime, which suggest submerged evidences on the west coast of India. But the equivalent submerged civilization of the east coast of India remains completely unexplored. There is a need to study the prehistoric human migration to assess the exact period of origin of the Indian civilization. There has to be a multidisciplinary and scientific approach to study the subject. Under the circumstances, analysis of available genetic data is extremely important, which will give us the direction of migration, period of migration and the extent of migration of prehistoric human population. I have discussed many of these issues in my previous episodes with Sangam Talks. I'll be grateful if you kindly watch them prior to watching this episode. However, we will be touching many of those subjects briefly before we go into the main topic of this episode. Latest archaeological evidences confirms that Indian civilization is at least 10,000 years old. I took a completely different approach to establish this period on the basis of available ground evidences. I explored entire Indian subcontinent for over 20 years to collect the ground evidences and analyze them on the basis of available scientific data. I authored a number of books, especially about the regions which are less explored and less documented, like Northeast India, Ladakh, pre-Portuguese Goa, Andamans, Nicobars and so on. It is surprising that ground evidences are not given due importance while arranging the pre-recorded period of India. In this context, one of the glaring examples is that we do not give a serious consideration about how the people of Andaman Archipelago reached there, that is the Andaman Aboriginal tribes. The origin and migration path of these Andaman Aboriginal tribes needs to be explained in a scientific manner, and in this episode we will try to do that as well. It is extremely important to understand the presence of the pre- and post-glacial period genetic identities all around the Bengal coast. Andaman tribes are definitely pre-glacial period genetic identities. It is observed that often they are not given due importance. Once we consider that Andaman Aboriginal tribes are pre-glacial period genetic identities and they are present in Andaman Archipelago, then it becomes almost obvious that post-glacial period genetic identities has formed in the neighboring region or around that region, and they have migrated from there at a later date. At this juncture, we have to understand who are the pre-glacial period genetic identities, what happened during the glacial period in and around the Andaman archipelago, and who are the post-glacial period genetic identities. That will help us to understand the migration path and the migration period of the post-glacial period genetic identities. After all, there has to be a connection between the site of origin of pre-glacial period genetic identities and the site of origin of the post-glacial period genetic identities. It is obvious that the post-glacial period genetic identities can only originate at a place where pre-glacial period population had continuously lived. It is most rational to consider that post-glacial period genetic identities like R1 alpha, R1 bravo and O haplogroup must have originated on the Bengal glacial coastal shelf between the Bengal coast and Andaman archipelago, as pre-glacial period population has survived in Andaman archipelago. As I explored Indian subcontinent for over 20 years, I realized that evidences suggest that Indian civilization had an intense connectivity with both the European civilization as well as with the Mediterranean region and Red Sea region. There is a concept regarding an ancient connectivity of Indian civilization with European civilization, and we believe that Indo-Aryans had come from Europe, but a connectivity of Indian civilization with Egyptian civilization or with the Red Sea region is not really discussed. It is observed that Indian origin fraternities had traveled to distant lands since a very early period. I have already discussed in my previous episodes that they had traveled from India to the Mediterranean region and reached Egypt and Eastern Mediterranean coast pretty early. And I have discussed that Pali-speaking fraternity had established a settlement which was known as Palistan, now Palestine. Reverse migration of the Pali-speaking fraternities established the 16 Mahajanapadas in central and northern India. Similarly, the reverse migration of the Sanskrit-speaking fraternity from Eastern Europe had returned, and this reverse migration is popularly known as Indo-Aryan migration. When I explored Northeast India, I found evidences to suggest that in the Dahoparbotia temple of Tejpur, Assam, there is evidence of Greek art. Similarly, we found that Ahom ancestral memorials, which are known as Maidems, are very similar to Egyptian pyramids structurally and functionally. Similarly, we realized that Israelis have confirmed their genetic identity with the Mizos, and then thereafter they gave permission or they gave visas to the Mizos, thereby establishing a genetic connectivity between the Mediterranean region and Northeast India. All these evidences of Indian civilization's connectivity with the Mediterranean region prompted me to explore Egypt. I found evidences much more than what I expected in Egypt. I wrote a book titled India in Egypt, in which I established that Egyptian civilization was established by the Indian origin people. I arranged a migration path from India to the Mediterranean region, Horn of Africa, Nile Delta, which is genetically, archaeologically, linguistically and culturally continuous. Presently, we try to establish this prehistoric period of India by reading one subject at a time, like anthropology, archaeology, genetics, history, ancient texts and so on. However, I realized that this single subject approach has its own limitation. Like the historians and archaeologists are possibly not considering genetics to that extent, whereas the global genetic map provides long distance connectivity of Indian population with different continents. Quite often, we are unable to even imagine that this genetic identity has traveled from one continent to the other and at a very early period. The other day I watched a video which established that Bengali language has a connectivity with French language. Now, the research team of that video presentation, they have found a definite linguistic connectivity, but they have failed to establish how is it possible. So they presented it in the form of a puzzle. Whereas when we see the global genetic distribution of R1 bravo haplogroup, then we realize that Bengal and France has same R1 bravo genetic identity, and thereby they have an ethnic connectivity. resulting in this linguistic connectivity. Professor Suniti Kumar Chatterjee, a world-famous linguist, had written a book called India and Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a lot of Sanskrit words and Sanskrit names in their history and in their literature. Now again, when we see the global genetic distribution map of R1 Bravo haplogroup, we realize that India and Ethiopia both has R1 Bravo haplogroups. As there is a genetic connectivity between these two regions, there has to be an ethnic connectivity and thereby linguistic connectivity. So, this R1 Bravo global distribution map is actually providing us a scientific explanation of this puzzling linguistic connectivity. In this episode, I would like to make an effort to establish the migration path along which this R1 Bravo had traveled to Western Europe as well as Central Africa. At this stage, whatever hypothetical migration path we establish, it has to be compatible with the available genetic data. I had to study all the genetic papers related to the human migration or related to migration of Indian population all over the world. Genetics was not an unknown subject to me considering my medical post-graduation background. I am making an humble effort to state what I have understood regarding the migration of the Indian population all over the world based on available global genetic maps. I realized that there is a need to take a multidisciplinary approach to actually establish the antiquity of Indian civilization in a scientific manner. In my book, India in Egypt, I had to discuss about various information collected from various subjects like anthropology, archaeology, genetics, history, language, and also from our ancient texts like Rig Veda. We have been made to understand that India has been a melting pot and people have come to India from different directions. Like Indo-Aryans have arrived from Europe with their Indo-European language. Similarly, Austroasiatics and Tibeto-Burmans have come from the east. There are many books which establishes this book, including some by Indian authors which also follow the same hypothesis, in spite of knowing that India has some evidences which suggest that anatomical modern human lived in India almost continuously since their arrival from Africa 65,000 years ago. India as a melting pot is applicable only when we consider the events related to the last 3,000 to 4,000 years, that is the period of reverse migration of the Indian origin fraternities back to India. This was not the primary migration of the Indian fraternities. Genetic evidences strongly suggest a view that Indian fraternities have traveled to distant lands at a much earlier period, 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. We are AMH or anatomically modern humans. Anatomically modern humans originated in Africa about 2 lakh years ago. Anatomical modern humans who came out of Africa about 65 to 70,000 years ago have actually survived, and they reached India pretty early following their out of Africa move and as they followed Great Coastal Migration. We do have definite evidence of anatomical modern humans surviving in India continuously for this entire period since their arrival 65,000 years ago. A recent genetic study of Andaman population has confirmed that there are at least 2 genetic identities there, M31 and M32 mtDNA haplogroups. I personally feel that these two are the groups which entered Andaman during 2 consecutive glacial periods. During glacial period, global temperature reduces, resulting in ice formation in North and South Pole as well as in the Alps and the Himalayas. This ice formation takes place consuming water from the nearby sea. This results in decrease in the sea level all over the world, and that results in the formation of a huge land bridge connecting Bengal coast with Andaman archipelago, and along that land bridge Andaman Aboriginal tribes walk into the Andamans. Now, I personally feel that during a previous glacial period, which occurred approximately 50,000 years ago, a group of Aboriginal tribes including Jarwas and the Onges reached Andaman archipelago, whereas during a second glacial period which occurred about 20 to 25,000 years ago, the next group, which includes the Great Andamanis, managed to enter the Andaman archipelago walking. We see these Aboriginal tribes in Andaman, but we do not make an effort to understand how did they reach there. Obviously, they have not reached there by air or by ship like we do today. Did they walk into Andaman archipelago? Even that we do not normally discuss. During interglacial period, as the global temperature increases, that results in melting of the snow of the poles as well as of the Himalayas and Alps. That causes rise of the seawater and that causes submersion of the landmass which forms between Bengal coast and Andaman. That results in migration of the settled population there. I was posted in Andaman as an ophthalmologist for 3 years. Thus, I could watch these Aboriginal tribes of Andaman quite closely. We have to make an effort to understand the events related to the presence of anatomical modern human in India since their arrival from Africa 65,000 years ago. Similarly, we see a large number of dark complexion tribes only south of the Vindhya Parbat. We do not even consider that why these dark complexion tribes are not there in North India, why they are not there in Northeast India, why they are not there anywhere else in Eurasia. These dark complexion tribes are a very unique AMH identity. Possibly they belong to pre-glacial period or early post-glacial period who are not there anywhere else but in India. Because they belong to a different period, they were identified as ancestral South Indian in a recent genetic study. When we analyze the evidences preserved in India and arrange them in a meaningful manner, a completely new narrative of early human migration or early human migration during the post-glacial period emerges. My multidisciplinary study suggested that Indian origin fraternities had traveled from India to Mediterranean region, Horn of Africa, Nile Delta and Greece, and they have established the ancient civilizations of the world. I personally traveled to Egypt, Greece, Turkey, Jordan, Israel to collect archaeological evidences present at that end as well as see the cultural evidences which exist in their culture. I had to introduce and discuss a number of new subjects to explain my way of arranging or my way of explaining the new narrative of human migration during the post-glacial period.
Genetic identities are transmitted both through maternal and paternal roots. Maternal genetic identities are known as mtDNA haplogroups, which are transmitted from mother to both sons and daughters. On the other hand, the paternal genetic identities remain exclusively in the Y-sex chromosome and transmitted from the father only to his son and not to his daughter. It is observed that R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome are two principal paternal genetic identities present in some parts of Eurasia and Northern African region. Tracing the presence of these two paternal genetic identities is essential to identify the direction of their spread in different parts of the world. It appears that these genetic identities originated during the last glacial period and their spread occurred during the last interglacial period starting from 12,000 years ago. Identification of the site of origin of the newer genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome is most crucial issue in order to understand the process of migration of the early human fraternities. These two newer genetic identities spread not only in the Eurasia region, but R1 bravo haplogroup also spread to Africa. As I have discussed in my book titled India in Egypt, several animal symbols were adopted by different ethnic fraternities as their ethnic identity. As they migrated from the east coast, they spread Indian languages to those distant lands. What was so special about the east coast of India where all these ethnic fraternities developed? Is it possible that newer AMH fraternities like R1 alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome originated in this region? Unless we are able to establish the unique nature of the Bengal-Myanmar coast to justify the origin of the newer genetic identities, the discussion regarding the migration of various ethnic fraternities from the east coast becomes baseless, and so will be the case regarding the spread of Indian languages. Interestingly, R1 alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome genetic identity is found in the entire Indo-European language speaking territory extending from Eastern India to Western Europe. Thus, this entire territory is clearly linguistically and genetically continuous. Europe has high percentage of R1 Bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome genetic identity. This genetic identity is also found in various other regions of Asia including India and Mesopotamia, and also in the Afro-Asian speaking Central Africa. Presently, it is believed that R1 alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome both originated in Eastern Europe near the European Steppe and Anatolia region. Whereas it appears that a unique geophysical phenomena which took place on the east coast of India during the last glacial period is responsible for the origin of these two newer genetic identities in that region. It is extremely crucial to establish the site of origin of R1 alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome on the Bengal glacial coastal shelf during the last glacial period. That would provide us the direction of the migration of the post-glacial period anatomically modern human fraternities from east to west, which started 12,000 years ago. This would also justify the spread of Indian languages and culture to distant lands. A number of Aboriginal tribes live in the Andaman archipelago. However, there is very little discussion about who were these people, when and how did they reach there. The only probable explanation is that they walked into the Andaman archipelago from the Bengal-Myanmar coast when a land bridge formed. During the glacial maximum, the sea level subsides by about 400 feet or 130 meters, and the Bengal coastline recedes connecting Andamans with the mainland. In the physical map of India, we find the Bay of Bengal region having a very shallow depth. During the last glacial period, for several thousand years, a huge coastal landmass surfaced between the Bengal and Myanmar coast, which is referred to as the Bengal Glacial Coastal Shelf in this book. During this time, the population of two distinct genetic territories, the east coast of India and Southeast Asia, intermixed. And this genetic union produced newer genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome. As the seawater gradually rose during the interglacial period, this coastal landmass submerged, displacing the settled population. They settled on the Bengal coast and adopted various animal symbols as mentioned before as their ethnic identity. To begin with, they were bare-bodied and were known as Naga, popularly known as Nanga in Hindi, who adopted the Naga or serpent as their ethnic symbol. It is possible that their mother goddess was Kali, who is also depicted bare-bodied. Some of these early fraternities eventually migrated following the Trans-Himalayan migration routes pivoting Mount Kailash. The Indus Valley civilization emerged on this route. They continued their journey and established the Egyptian and Greek civilizations. For this reason, we find R1 Bravo reaching Mediterranean coast, Afro-Asian speaking Africa, and also in Western Europe. Now let us discuss the present view regarding the identification of the site of origin of R1 Bravo and R1 alpha haplogroups. This is the present map available regarding the distribution of R1 Bravo haplogroup in the Y chromosome in the world. R1 Bravo haplogroup is found in Europe, Middle East, Northern Africa, and in scattered form in Asia. It is observed that though the concentration of R1 Bravo is much more in Western Europe, European steppe located in extreme Eastern Europe is considered as its site of origin, considering that older divisions of R1 Bravo are found in the east. But in spite of having several pockets of R1 Bravo farther east and on the Bengal coast, any eastern location as the probable site of origin of R1 Bravo haplogroup is never considered. Interestingly, several pockets of RPH 155, which is commonly known as R1 Bravo 1 Bravo, are found in isolated locations, for example in Bhutan, Ladakh, Xinjiang province of western China north of Ladakh, Yunnan province of southern China close to northeast India, Tajikistan, Turkey and Bahrain. Scholars admit that the presence of these pockets is difficult to explain if the origin of R1 Bravo haplogroup is considered to be the European steppe. Moreover, there is no linguistic continuity between European steppe and Afro-Asian speaking Africa where R1 Bravo is present. Thus, there are several unsolved puzzles which create obstacles to accept the European steppe as the site of origin of R1 Bravo haplogroup. Genetic studies involving European population had started a couple of decades ago. Hence, more genetic data of that region are now available. As other territories got included in the genetic studies, unusual R1 Bravo pockets emerged which further complicated the issue. Indian population have been included in the genetic studies comparatively recently. In the recent studies published by the global scholars, a few pockets of R1 Bravo have emerged in India which demands a serious attention. Interestingly, an isolated pocket of R1 Bravo genetic identity is found on the east coast of India, which has not received the required attention so far. Kivisil study conducted in 2003 shows that 6.5% population of West Bengal have R1 Bravo, which is quite significant. These isolated pockets need to be included while charting the early migration paths of the fraternity. In fact, it is even possible that this pocket is the oldest settlement of the R1 Bravo genetic identity from where earliest migration of R1 Bravo started. Once we arrange the migration path of R1 Bravo originating from the Bengal coast, all other pockets of R1 Bravo, including the isolated pocket of Bahrain, could be connected along the two continuous migration paths. Now let us discuss the present view regarding the origin of the R1 alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome, which is exclusively found in the Indo-European speaking territory. Underhill and his team published a number of papers following their periodic studies on the subject. His map on the origin of R1 alpha also suggested that it originated in the Anatolia and European steppe region. However, the map drawn on the basis of a recent study by the same team confirmed that a pocket of oldest R1 alpha haplogroup is found in western India near Gujarat, and two pockets of high concentration of R1 alpha zone are found in the Himalayan region. Many scholars thus feel that the site of origin of R1 alpha haplogroup in South Asia cannot be ruled out. Though in this map, Bengal is not shown as one of the important sites harboring R1 alpha in the region, almost all the studies, including Underhill studies, have confirmed that R1 alpha is found in significant number in West Bengal. In fact, as per the study by Sharma in 2009, 72% of the Brahmin population of West Bengal has R1 alpha haplogroup, one of the highest percentage of R1 alpha in the world. Moreover, Bengali language not only belongs to the Indo-European language branch, but it has a significant component of Sanskrit and Prakrito, two of the oldest languages of the group. It is much easier to detect a pocket of early genetic fraternities in a remote region where the population remained relatively undisturbed, like in the Himalayan region and Gujarat. On the other hand, it is extremely difficult to locate a pocket of early R1 alpha in Bengal, as this region received a number of reverse migration fraternities over millennia till a recent period from different directions. Thus, Bengal is expected to have the most complex form of genetic admixture, posing a challenge for the geneticist to analyze its composition. It is interesting to observe that Bengal region not only has a linguistic continuity with Europe as Indo-European speakers, but it also has genetic continuity with Europe, where R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome are primary genetic identities. It is likely that a very early migration of post-glacial period anatomically modern humans or AMH fraternities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome had taken place from India to the West with their language and culture. The distribution of the R1 bravo haplogroups detected all over the world has a striking similarity with the migration path of the R1 bravo haplogroup proposed in this book. They originated on the Bengal coastal shelf and migrated along the Himalayan rivers as their settlements submerged at the onset of the interglacial period. As they reached the junction at Mount Kailash, they followed two distinct routes. One route descended along River Indus and followed Makran coast to reach Central Africa, entering the continent through the Horn of Africa. In this way, R1 bravo haplogroup reached Bahrain on this path. The other route from Mount Kailash reached Europe through Anatolia or Turkey and European steppe. This migration started 10,000 years ago or before at the onset of the interglacial period, more specifically during the meltwater pulse 1b of the interglacial period. Similarly, about 5,800 years ago, as the settlements of the R1 alpha submerged on the Bengal coast during the meltwater pulse 1c of the interglacial period, another wave of migration started. They also followed the Himalayan rivers from Bengal coast to reach Mount Kailash and divided into two branches. One branch descended along the Indus to Gujarat and Balochistan, where an old division of R1 alpha was detected by the Underhill genetic study team. The other branch from Mount Kailash reached Eastern Europe, entering the continent through Anatolia and European steppe. Thus, we find another old division of R1 alpha detected by the Underhill team in that region. According to a 2014 study by Underhill, R1 alpha M417 divided into two lineages, Z93 and Z282, about 5,800 years ago. Z93 is more common in Indian subcontinent, while Z282 is in Europe. This suggests that these two lineages dissociated 5,800 years ago when R1 alpha spread from India to Eastern Europe across the Himalayas, and these two lineages flourished in their respective territories. Both the R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups from India entered Europe through the European steppe and Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, and hence this region possesses oldest division of both these genetic identities found within Europe. This region thus erroneously appears to be the site of origin of both these genetic identities. 10,000 years ago, R1 bravo spread to Mediterranean coast, Egypt and Africa with Pali and Prakrito languages. On the other hand, 5,800 years ago, R1 alpha spread to Eastern Europe with spoken Sanskrit language. It is important that we understand that both R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome originated on the east coast of India, and from there they spread along with their language and cultural characteristics. Only then the archaeological, linguistic and cultural elements of India found all over Eurasia and Africa, especially in Egypt, would be much easier to appreciate. The Egyptian civilization, one of the oldest civilizations which emerged in Africa, was possibly developed by the people who had come from India with their language and culture. In fact, as we arrange the migration path of early genetic identities originating from India, a very interesting observation emerges. All the ancient civilizations like the Indus Valley civilization, Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Egyptian and Greek civilization can be found along the two migration paths originating from India. European territory can be compared with a jar with its opening towards the European steppe and Anatolia on the east. During the last interglacial period, newer genetic identities like the R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups entered Europe through descent, starting from 8,000 years ago. During this time, agriculture also entered Europe through Anatolia or modern-day Turkey. The Proto-Indo-European language possibly entered Europe around 5,800 years ago along with the R1 alpha haplogroup in the Y chromosome. On the purely genetic front, it appears that the R1 Bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome reached Europe around 8,000 years ago. They reached in good number as the Trans-Himalayan migration path pivoting Mount Kailash opened. At a later date, around 5,800 years ago, R1 alpha haplogroup arrived in Europe along with their spoken Sanskrit language. As they reached Europe from the east, they pushed the R1 Bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome more towards the west. So today we find R1 Bravo concentration more towards Western Europe as this R1 Bravo distribution map suggests. However, interestingly, it has been found that older branches of R1 Bravo haplogroups are found towards the east near the European steppe as they had entered through Europe through this route. On the other hand, as the R1 alpha haplogroup arrived later from the east, we find their concentration more towards Eastern Europe as these R1 alpha distribution map portrays R1 alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome also introduced spoken Sanskrit which served as the Proto-Indo-European language. The phenomena of the reverse migration of these Indian origin fraternities back to India is now referred to as the Indo-Aryan invasion. It appears that the R1 Bravo haplogroup spread from India during the first wave of migration which reached Mediterranean coast, Egypt and Afro-Asian speaking Africa. From these regions, I found another interesting axis along which R1 Bravo haplogroup reached Western Europe directly across the Mediterranean Sea. Along with them, Indian language and culture must have reached Western Europe pretty early. We find a territory called Basque in France and Spain with a different culture and language. Interestingly, Basque language does not belong to the Indo-European branch and hence it is considered as one of the lingua isolate. Obviously, this culture and language must have arrived here much before the European culture and Indo-European language reached this region. Archaeologically also, we find spread of bell beaker culture along this route reaching Western Europe which lasted from 2800 BC to 1800 BC. Coincidentally, as the Indian origin people started migrating from this region back to India, this form of art disappeared from Europe. Curiously, this reverse migration phenomena coincides with the collapse of several ancient civilizations of the world. The Indian origin people approached Europe from two directions. One group entered via Turkey and European steppe, while the other directly reached Western Europe across the Mediterranean Sea. As a result, we find different pockets of bell beaker culture in Europe. Moreover, as it was carried by the Indian origin people, this culture was found associated with both R1 Bravo and R1 alpha haplogroups, but more with the first. Intriguingly, the shape of this bell beaker is still quite popular among the artisans of India. At this juncture, there is a definite need to search for the source from where these R1 Bravo and R1 alpha haplogroups in Y chromosome were spreading with their refined languages and advanced skills. This search is likely to lead you to the east coast of India. It is high time that we acknowledge that there was a refined civilization existing beyond Europe on its east since a very early period and possibly since the last glacial period. Interestingly, a number of archaeological sites have been discovered recently beyond Europe on the east, which suggests the direction of arrival of the fraternities with advanced knowledge and skill. The location of Göbekli Tepe and Jericho in southeast Turkey and around suggests their arrival from the east. These sites were created 12,000 years ago. The structure found there suggests that they were created by a refined fraternity and not by the primitive hunter-gatherers. It is time that we extended our vision farther east in search of the source of such advanced skill and knowledge. Recent discovery of large archaeological sites at the Gulf of Kambat Cultural Complex, Mehrgarh, Rakhigarhi, Virana, Kalibangan and so on establishes the route as they are all located on the migration path from eastern India to the Mediterranean coast as suggested in this book. These settlements have all been detected to have existed since around 10,000 years ago. They are clearly much older than whatever has been discovered in entire Europe so far. It appears that a refined civilization had developed on the east coast of India during the last glacial period. They were compelled to migrate along with their language and culture as their coastal settlements submerged since the onset of the interglacial period 12,000 years ago. These migrating fraternities established civilizations on the Mediterranean coast, Egypt and Europe. Gulf of Cambodge cultural complex has been discovered on this route from east coast of India to the Mediterranean coast region. There is one more important issue which needs to be settled regarding the site of origin of the newer genetic identities like the R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in the Y chromosome. It has been estimated that these genetic identities originated around 25,000 years ago. We find archaeological sites of Europe are only 9,000 years old. If we stick to the present view that these newer genetic identities originated in the European steppe and Anatolia, then it becomes difficult to explain this period gap where they took 16,000 years to reach rest of Europe from European steppe. Moreover, archaeological sites of Göbekli Tepe and Natufian culture have emerged in the meantime, which are 12 to 14,000 years old and are located in the southeast Turkey and on the Mediterranean coast, much to the east of Europe. In this case also, they took 10,000 years to reach eastern Mediterranean coast from their site of origin in the European steppe. Thus, these recent findings do not match with the period of origin of the newer genetic identities and their direction of movement. On the other hand, it is possible that these newer genetic identities originated on the Bengal coast during the last glacial period when the coastal landmass emerged around 25,000 years ago. They migrated only when their settlements started submerging around 12 to 14,000 years ago at the onset of the interglacial period. On their way to the Mediterranean coast and Europe, they established Gulf of Cambodge cultural complex, Mehergarh, Natufian culture, Göbekli Tepe, and settled in similar other ancient sites. Thereafter, they reached Anatolia and European steppe to enter Europe. If we consider this view, then the present genetic observations and archaeological findings match in a more acceptable manner.
The genetic composition of the world population has been charted very well in the last 2 or 3 decades. So those maps are now available with us. When we see these genetic maps, we see that each genetic identity had traveled from one continent to the other. So we have to expand our canvas, which includes the entire world. Then only we will be able to appreciate that a particular genetic identity had traveled from one end of one continent to the other end of the other continent. Now we have to settle the most important issue, that is, all these genetic identities have traveled from east to west or from west to east. Whether they have traveled from India to the Mediterranean region or they have come from Europe or from the Mediterranean region to India. That is the core issue at this stage, which these genetic data would help us to arrange. As I have mentioned, I am convinced that post-glacial period genetic migration took place from India to the Mediterranean region and which started about 12 to 14,000 years ago as the interglacial period set in and the sea level started going up, submerging the coastal landmass of India. To understand my onward and reverse migration hypothesis, we have to keep this global genetic data map available to us. I personally feel that amongst R1 alpha and R1 bravo migration took place about 10 to 12,000 years ago, whereas R1 alpha migration took place much later, about 6,000 years ago. Let us make an attempt to understand the migration of the R1 bravo haplogroup first, and that can easily be done by connecting the regions where the R1 bravo haplogroup is still detectable. I mean, the pockets of R1 bravo now found, if they are connected, all these dots, then we can find the migration path. West Bengal has 6.5% urban Bravo, Punjabi 7.6%, Pathan 9.5%, Pakistani Hazara 32%, Baloch 8%, and so on along the proposed migration path. Eventually, we find migration of R1 Bravo from Bengal to Gujarat, and from there to Mediterranean region, Horn of Africa, and through that they reached Central Africa or the Chadic region of Afro-Asian speaking Africa, and they also traveled trans-Mediterranean to reach Western Europe. It is most logical to consider that it had spread from India, and thus India has both linguistic and cultural continuity with both Chadic region of Central Africa, which is Afro-Asian speaking, as well as with Western Europe, which is Indo-European speaking territory. Now let us make an effort to arrange the migration of R1 alpha haplogroup. It appears that following the submersion of the third phase of Bengal glacial coastal shelf about 6,000 years ago, R1 alpha spread from India with the spoken Sanskrit language to Eastern Europe. It has been determined by the geneticists that R1 alpha and R1 bravo both originated around 25,000 years ago. This suggests that they originated during the last glacial period. Thus, they could have originated only at a place where at that period, pre-glacial period fraternities lived. This can be seen in the Andaman archipelago, which was possibly connected with the Bengal glacial coastal shelf landmass during the glacial period. It thus suggests that India is genetically and linguistically connected with both Central Africa and Western Europe. It thus appears that both R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroup in all probability spread from east coast of India to the Mediterranean region. This can be established with available genetic and linguistic evidences. It is possible to arrange the archaeological evidences also along this path, as I have discussed in detail in my book. However, the oldest archaeological evidences on the east coast of India got submerged during the post-glacial period because of the rising sea level. These archaeological evidences could only be detected if we undertake marine archaeological survey. It is possible to arrange the migration path of the Pali speakers from India to the Mediterranean region, where they established a settlement called Palistan, which is now known as Palestine. It is worth considering that they actually managed to reach the Basque region, that is in southern France and northern Spain, where a community lives whose language is different from that of Indo-European languages which arrived from the north along with R1 alpha. Reverse migration of Pali-speaking fraternities resulted in the origin of the 16 Mahajanapadas or mega cities in central and northern India. Reverse migration of Sanskrit-speaking fraternity from Eastern Europe across Mount Kailas resulted in a region in northern India which is known as Vedic territory, that is early Vedic territory and late Vedic territory, and this is commonly known as Indo-Aryan migration. It appears that following reverse migration of Indian origin fraternities from Egypt and Europe, we had Sanskrit and Pali speakers settle in different regions of India. Eventually, Sanskrit speakers managed to dominate major parts of India. However, along the east coast of India, matriarchal communities, Austroasiatic and Dravidian communities remained in their respective territories. These resulted in the formation of a very complex ethnic fusion in India. So far, we have discussed about R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups, two of the primary paternal haplogroups which had spread from India to the Western world. We have to also consider about the third major post-glacial period genetic identity or O haplogroup, which had spread to the east of India as well. OM95 is one of the oldest O haplogroup found in eastern India. Their maximum concentration has been detected amongst the Mundari speakers of Bengal Odisha coast. Amongst the three post-glacial period genetic identities, namely O haplogroup, R1 alpha and R1 bravo, O haplogroup is not present in European steppe, where some scholars believe that both R1 alpha and R1 bravo may have originated. On the other hand, in India, we find presence of all three post-glacial period genetic identities. More strikingly, all three are present on the east coast of India, which is extremely significant. These strongly suggest that east coast of India had a direct connectivity with the Bengal glacial coastal shelf region, where all three post-glacial period genetic identities had originated during the last glacial period. Over a period of time, a large number of Indian origin fraternities returned to India, and this is referred to as reverse migration in my book. They returned because of various reasons. As the patriarchal culture evolved in Europe and in Egypt, the matriarchal community preferred to come back, and at a later date, as the Christianity and Islam originated in the Western Asia, the Hindu community who followed Indian culture and Indian religious concepts, they also preferred to come back to India. These resulted in the silent collapse of Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Egyptian and Minoan civilization, as they were primarily created and maintained by the Indian origin fraternities. Reverse migration of Sanskrit-speaking Indian origin people is referred to as Indo-Aryan migration. As they were essentially Indian origin people, their genetic identity was similar except minimal alteration which was detected by the genetic studies. This reverse migration Indian origin fraternities was referred to as ancestral North Indian in a recent genetic study. It is interesting to note that various communities settled in the Mediterranean region were aware about their ancestral place. They actually referred to their ancestral place in India as Ganga Ridhi. We find that a number of Greek, Roman and Egyptian scholars have recorded authentic information about Ganga Ridhi in their historical notes. They are now easily available as we search for Ganga Ridhi in Google. I fail to understand that if such authentic historical records are available about ancient India in Western records, why Ganga Ridhi is completely eliminated from Indian history. It clearly establishes that Ganga Ridhi was a militarily powerful Indian kingdom which even Alexander feared. At the end, we have to appreciate that India played a crucial role in the post-glacial period migration of human fraternity. Unless we analyze and understand the complexity of the genetic composition of India, we will not be able to understand the process of spread of post-glacial period genetic identities all over the world. I have provided enough evidence to suggest that post-glacial period fraternities had migrated from India during the last 10 to 12,000 years. But unfortunately, there is little discussion on all these evidences at the national or at the global level.
India needs a special attention of the global scholars to understand the process of early migration of anatomically modern humans all over the major parts of the world.
Thank you. Jai Hind.